In the stone corredores of Millbank Prison, London, 1947, a desperate woman's voice cuts through the morning silence. Sarah Whitmore clutches her 6-month-old son against her chest, his cries echoing off the damp walls as she moves from cell to cell. Her crime was stealing bread to feed this very child. Now they're both prisoners, trapped in a system that sees them as nothing more than burdens to be managed. "I can clean your cell, wash your floors," she pleads with anyone who will listen, guards and inmates alike. "Please just hold my baby while I work." The other women turn away, hardened by their own survival. The guards ignore her completely, but in the shadows of Block C, someone is watching, someone whose own story of loss will soon intertwine with hers in ways neither could imagine. What happens when the most unlikely person becomes a mother's only hope? Well, before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning bell clanged through Millbank Prison like a death knell, reverberating off the pentagon-shaped walls that had housed London's most desperate souls for nearly 3 decades. Sarah Whitmore pressed her back against the cold stone of the women's corridor, feeling the vibration travel through her spine as baby Thomas stirred against her chest. His christening gown, once pristine white with delicate embroidered angels, now hung yellow and stained from weeks of prison life. The architecture itself seemed designed to crush hope. 5 massive blocks radiated from a central hub like the spokes of a broken wheel, each one a testament to the Victorian belief that punishment should be as much about suffering as justice. The corridors stretched endlessly, lined with iron doors that sealed away humanity behind numbers instead of names. Sarah had become number 2. Thomas had no number at all. Matron Howick's heavy boots announced her approach long before her stern face appeared around the corner. A woman carved from the same unforgiving stone as the prison walls. She had overseen the women's block for 15 years, with an iron fist wrapped in institutional righteousness. Her grey dress was immaculate, her keys jangling like chains of office. "Whitmore," she barked, not bothering to look directly at Sarah. "You're assigned to laundry detail today. The other women have complained about your disturbances." Behind Matron Howick strode Guard Captain Morrison, a man whose cruelty had become legendary even in a place built on suffering. His uniform was pristine, brass buttons gleaming, but his eyes held the cold calculation of someone who had learned to profit from others' misery. He paused, studying Sarah with the detached interest of a scientist examining a specimen. "The child looks poorly," Morrison observed, his voice carrying no concern, only practical assessment. "Might be better to separate them. We have arrangements for such cases." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She knew what those arrangements meant. The workhouse, the foundling hospitals, where children disappeared into systems that ground up the unwanted and forgotten. Her arms tightened around Thomas instinctively. "Please," Sarah whispered, then found her voice growing stronger. "I can work harder. I can clean anywhere you need. Just let me keep him with me. He's all I have left." The memory of William surfaced unbidden, her husband's calloused hands gentle on her pregnant belly, his voice rough from dock work, but soft with wonder, as he felt Thomas kick for the first time. William, who had fallen beneath a cargo net at the London docks, just 3 months before Thomas was born, leaving her with nothing but love for a child and no way to feed him. She had tried everything before resorting to theft, sewing until her fingers bled, taking in washing until her back screamed in protest, even begging on street corners with Thomas crying from hunger. The loaf of bread she had stolen had been for him, always for him. The other women in the corridor had heard this plea before. They passed by with averted eyes, some carrying their own burdens of loss and desperation. Catherine Webb, a pickpocket from Whitechapel, actually sneered as she walked past. She had learned that survival in Millbank meant looking out for yourself and no one else. Old Mary Fitzgerald shuffled by more slowly, her bent frame a testament to 70 years of hardship. She alone met Sarah's eyes for a moment, and in that brief connection, Sarah saw something that looked almost like sympathy. But Mary was too weak, too close to her own end, to offer more than that fleeting acknowledgement of shared suffering. "The boy disturbs the peace," Morrison continued, his tone bureaucratic and final. Prison regulations clearly state that maintaining order takes precedence over individual circumstances. As if summoned by the conversation, Thomas began to cry again, his small voice echoing off the stone wall. The sound was weak, not the lusty cry of a healthy infant, but the feeble protest of a child fighting to survive in conditions no baby should endure. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and Sarah could feel how much weight he had lost in their weeks of imprisonment. The prison's daily routine ground on around him, indifferent to individual tragedy. Women shuffled past, carrying buckets of dirty water, their movements mechanical and lifeless. Guards patrolled with expressions of practiced indifference. The system had learned to function despite human suffering, perhaps because of it. 1 week, Morrison decided with cold finality, if the child continues to disrupt operations, we'll implement alternative arrangements. He turned on his heel, dismissing Sarah's existence as easily as he might swat a fly. Matron Harwick lingered a moment longer, her eyes holding something that might have been regret in a softer woman. But years of institutional service had hardened her beyond such luxuries as compassion. That evening Sarah returned to her cell with aching arms and a heart heavy with memories. The cramped space barely accommodated a thin straw mattress and a wooden bucket that served purposes she preferred not to dwell upon. In the corner, wedged into a crack between two stones, lay her most precious possession after Thomas, her wedding ring. She had hidden it there on her second day, after watching another woman have her jewelry confiscated and sold to pay for her keep. The simple gold band was all that remained of her life before this place, before desperation had driven her to steal bread from Baker Morrison's shop on Fleet Street. William's face came to her now as clearly as if he sat beside her in the dim cell. His brown eyes had sparkled with mischief when they first met at a church social, his dockworker's hands surprisingly gentle when he had asked her to dance. They had married within 6 months, both of them orphans who had found family in each other. Their tiny room above Miss Henderson's boarding house had been paradise. William would return from the docks each evening, his clothes smelling of salt and rope, his pockets sometimes holding small treasures, a smooth pebble, unusual shell, once even a piece of amber, with a tiny insect trapped inside like a moment frozen in time. "For our boy," he had said, placing the amber in her hands when she was 7 months along, something beautiful from his father's world. The amber was gone now, sold along with everything else after William's death. The dock accident had been swift, a snapping cable, a falling cargo net, and the man she loved was simply gone. No compensation, no pension, just a body to bury and bills she could never. Thomas had arrived 2 weeks after the funeral, as if he had waited for his father to leave before making his entrance into a world that had already shown its cruelty. Sarah had held him in their tiny room, looking into eyes that were William's in miniature, and promised she would find a way to keep him safe. The promises had been easier to make than to keep. Mrs. Henderson had been patient at first, but patience didn't pay rent. Sarah's sewing skills, adequate for mending and simple alterations, couldn't compete with the skilled seamstresses in the better shops. Her attempts to find work as a laundress left Thomas crying alone for hours while she scrubbed other people's clothing for pennies. The eviction notice had arrived on a gray February morning, written in harsh black ink that seemed to bleed judgment across the page. 3 days to vacate, 3 days to find another life somewhere else with a baby and no money and no prospects. She had tried the churches first. Father McKenna, at St. Bartholomew's, had listened with kind eyes but empty hands. The congregation was poor, he explained, most of them struggling themselves. He could offer prayers but little else. The workhouse loomed as the only option, but Sarah had heard the story. Families separated, children lost in a system that valued order over love. She would rather starve than surrender Thomas to that fate. So she had taken the bread, 1 loaf from a shop that threw away yesterday's unsold goods. She hadn't even managed to feed it to Thomas before the constables found her, still holding the evidence of her crime like a confession. Theft is theft, the magistrate had pronounced, his voice echoing in the courthouse where justice was dispensed, like rations, measured, calculated, and insufficient for the hunger it was meant to address. 6 months hard labor, The irony wasn't lost on her. The system that criminalized her desperate attempt to feed her child now demanded she care for that same child in conditions that made survival nearly impossible. In the cell next to hers, she could hear Catherine Webb muttering to herself, practicing the stories she would tell to avoid work detail tomorrow. Catherine had been here 8 months for pickpocketing, and she had learned to navigate the prison's unwritten rules with the same skill she had once used to lift wallets from gentlemen's pockets. Crying won't change nothing, Catherine had told her on the first day. Prison don't care about your sob story. None of us do. But even Catherine's hardened indifference couldn't completely mask the recognition in her eyes. They were all here because the world outside had failed them in one way or another. The difference was that some had learned to let their hearts turn to stone, while others, like Sarah, clung to whatever love remained. Old Mary Fitzgerald coughed in the cell across the corridor, a sound that spoke of lungs damaged by years of factory work before her imprisonment for stealing medicine for a sick grandchild. Block C housed the men considered too dangerous for the general population. Its reputation preceded it through whispered conversations and fearful glances. Even the guards walked differently there, their hands never far from their truncheons, their eyes constantly scanning for trouble that might emerge from any shadow. Marcus Kane occupied cell 14, a space that had become as much his kingdom as his prison over the past 3 years. Unlike the other cells with their bare walls and desperate scratchings, Marcus's space held an air of careful organization. His few possessions were arranged with military precision, and in the corner, carved from a piece of smuggled wood, sat a small cross that bore the marks of patient, skillful hands. The other inmates gave Marcus a wide berth, not from fear of violence, though his reputation suggested he was capable of it, but from something deeper. He carried himself with the bearing of a man who had seen too much of the world's darkness and emerged with his honor intact, a quality that made lesser men uncomfortable. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Kane, as he had once been known, had commanded respect on battlefields from the peninsula to Waterloo. His men had followed him not because regulations demanded it, but because he had earned their loyalty through shared hardship and unwavering principle. The army had been his life, his identity, his family after his own parents died of fever when he was barely 16. The transition to civilian life had proven more challenging than any military campaign. Without the structure of army life, without the clear objectives and defined enemies, Marcus had struggled to find his place in a world that seemed to value different qualities than those that had made him an exceptional soldier. Marriage to Eleanor had brought unexpected joy. She was the daughter of a country pastor, a woman of gentle strength, who saw past his military bearing to the man beneath. Their daughter, little Alice, had completed a picture of domestic happiness he had never dared imagine possible. The cottage in Surrey had been modest, but perfect, surrounded by gardens that Eleanor tended with the same care she brought to everything in their life together. Marcus had found work managing the estate of a local landowner, using his organizational skills to bring order to neglected accounts and inefficient systems. For 5 years they had built something beautiful together. Alice grew from infant to a bright, curious child who could wrap her father around her finger with a single smile. She had Eleanor's gentle nature, but inherited her father's stubborn determination, a combination that delighted them both. The end had come with the swift brutality that Marcus remembered from war. Eleanor, struck down by consumption in what should have been the prime of her life. He had held her hand as she grew weaker, promising to care for Alice, to keep their family's love alive even in her absence. Grief had made him careless. The men who came for Alice in the night thought they were targeting a broken widower, someone too lost in sorrow to fight back effectively. They were gentlemen from London, wealthy men who believed their money and social position gave them the right to take whatever they wanted. They had miscalculated badly. The Marcus Kane who emerged from his cottage that night was not a grieving widower, but a soldier defending what remained of his family. The skills that had kept him alive through countless battles served him well against men who had never faced real violence, only the kind they inflicted on those too weak to resist. He had found Alice in the woods behind their cottage, her dress torn, her young mind already beginning to retreat into the protective numbness that would claim her completely in the months that followed. The men responsible lay broken in the moonlight, their elegant clothes stained with consequences they had never imagined. The trial had been a foregone conclusion. Men of wealth and position, even dead ones, commanded more justice than a former soldier, with no connections and a daughter too damaged to testify coherently. The magistrate had listened to testimony about Marcus's violent past, his military training, his known capacity for killing. Self-defense became murder, protection became brutality, love became obsession, in the mouths of barristers, paid to rewrite truth into something more palatable for genteel society. Alice had died in the asylum 6 months after the trial, her spirit finally surrendering to wounds that went deeper than anything physical. Marcus learned of her death through a brief note, delivered to his cell, written in the impersonal language of institutional efficiency. Now he sat in Block C, serving a sentence for crimes that felt like justice in a world that had forgotten the meaning of the word. The other inmates knew better than to test him, sensing the controlled violence that lived beneath his carefully maintained exterior. The fever came in the 3rd week of March, arriving like an unwelcome visitor who refused to leave. Thomas's small body burned against Sarah's chest as she paced the narrow confines of her cell, her cracked tin cup sitting uselessly on the floor where it had fallen from her trembling hand. She had been using the cup to give him water, carefully rationed drops that she had boiled over the single candle flame allowed in her cell. Now the cup bore a deep dent from where it had struck the stone floor, rendering it nearly useless for its intended purpose. The sight of it filled her with a despair that went beyond its practical value. "Please," she whispered to Thomas, though she knew he couldn't understand her words. "Stay with me, little one. Stay with Mama." His breathing had grown shallow during the night, each breath a struggle that made her own chest tight with sympathetic panic. The healthy pink of his cheeks had faded to an alarming pallor, and his usual hungry cries had weakened to barely audible whimpers. The morning brought no relief. Sarah had managed perhaps an hour of fitful sleep before the prison bell dragged her back to consciousness and the terrible reality of her situation. Thomas felt lighter in her arms, as if the fever was burning away not just his strength, but his very substance. She made her way to the corridor with desperate purpose, approaching every guard and inmate with the same pleading urgency that had become her daily ritual. But today was different. Today carried the weight of genuine crisis. "I can clean your cell, wash your floors," she called out to Catherine Webb, who was returning from kitchen duty with traces of porridge still clinging to her apron. "Please just hold my baby while I work. He's sick. He needs help." Catherine paused, her hardened expression flickering for just a moment, as she looked at Thomas's fevered face. For an instant, Sarah thought she might have found compassion in the most unlikely place. But Catherine's features quickly resumed their practiced indifference. "Not my problem, love," Catherine said, though her voice lacked its usual harsh edge. "Got my own troubles to worry about." The rejection hit Sarah like a physical blow, but she pressed on. Mary Fitzgerald was sitting in her cell doorway, her arthritis making movement painful in the damp morning air. Surely someone of Mary's age would understand a mother's desperation. "Please, Mary," Sarah begged, kneeling beside the older woman. "Just for a few minutes. I can scrub the floors, clean the walls, anything you need. He's burning up with fever." Mary's weathered hands reached out instinctively toward the baby, maternal instinct stronger than prison-hardened caution. But her fingers trembled with age and weakness, and she pulled back with visible reluctance. "Child, these old hands can barely hold a cup steady," Mary said softly, her Irish accent thick with regret. "I'd drop the poor little thing, and then where would you be?" The morning progressed with Sarah growing more frantic. As Thomas's condition worsened, she approached every woman in the corridor, offering to trade her meager possessions, to take on extra work details, to give up her own food rations. Each rejection felt like another nail in her son's coffin. Guard Captain Morrison appeared for his morning inspection, his pristine uniform a stark contrast to the desperate scene before him. Sarah threw herself at his feet, clutching Thomas protectively while begging for medical attention. "The child needs a doctor," she pleaded, her voice breaking with exhaustion and fear. "I'll do anything, extra work, solitary confinement, anything you ask. Just help." Morrison looked down at her with the cold calculation of a man who had learned to see human suffering as merely another administrative problem to be managed. His gaze took in Thomas's fevered state,
with the detached interest of someone assessing lives. Prison regulations don't provide for medical care beyond basic necessities, he stated flatly. The child's condition is not the institution's responsibility. He's dying, Sarah whispered, the words torn from her throat like pieces of her soul. Then perhaps you should have considered that before you chose a life of crime, Morrison replied, his voice carrying the crushing weight of institutional indifference. The words hit Sarah with such force that she actually recoiled, her body curling protectively around Thomas as if she could shield him from the cruelty of the world itself. She remained on the stone floor long after Morrison's footsteps had faded, holding her fevered child, and feeling her own strength ebb away like water through broken stones. Desperation drove Sarah to a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. She worked her wedding ring free from its hiding place in the cell wall, the simple gold band catching what little light filtered through the barred window. It was warm from being pressed against her palm, and for a moment she could almost feel William's hand holding hers on their wedding day. The ring represented everything she had lost and everything she still hoped to save. It was her last connection to the life she had built with William, but Thomas's labored breathing made the choice clear. Love sometimes demanded the ultimate sacrifice. Sarah made her way through the prison corridors with purpose, seeking out anyone who might have access to medicine or medical knowledge. Her first stop was the kitchen, where some of the more enterprising inmates had established informal networks for trading contraband goods. I need medicine, she told Bridget O'Malley, a woman serving time for running an illegal gin house in 7 Dials. My baby has a fever. I can pay. Bridget's eyes fixed immediately on the wedding ring Sarah held out with trembling fingers. The gold caught her attention like a magnet, and Sarah could see the calculations running behind the woman's shrewd gaze. That's a pretty piece, Bridget admitted, reaching out to examine the ring more closely. Might be worth something to the right person. But medicine? That's harder to come by than you might think. Their negotiation was interrupted by the arrival of Nellie Ferris, a pickpocket whose jealous nature had made her enemies throughout the women's block. Nellie had been watching Sarah's movements with growing resentment, seeing in the younger woman's desperation an opportunity to settle old scores. Well, Nellie sneered, her voice carrying across the kitchen like poison. Look what we have here. Little Sarah thinks her troubles are more important than everyone else's. The confrontation escalated quickly. Nellie's accusations that Sarah was receiving special treatment struck a nerve with other inmates who had their own grievances against the world. The kitchen became a powder keg of frustrated emotions and competing desperation. You think you're better than us? Nellie continued, her voice rising. With your sad story and your precious baby, we all got troubles, sweetheart. Some of us just don't cry about them all day. Sarah tried to retreat, but Nellie grabbed her arm with surprising strength. The wedding ring flew from Sarah's grasp, skittering across the stone floor like a golden promise broke. Both women lunged for it simultaneously, and what followed was less a fight than a desperate scramble between two people who had nothing left to lose. Nellie was stronger and more experienced in prison violence, but Sarah fought with the fierce desperation of a mother protecting her child. She clawed and bit and struggled with a strength she didn't know she possessed, driven by the sound of Thomas's increasingly labored breathing, echoing in her memory. The struggle ended when Nellie's head struck the edge of a wooden table with a sickening crack. Blood began to pool on the stone floor, bright red against the gray, and suddenly the kitchen fell silent, except for the sound of Sarah's ragged breathing. Guard Captain Morrison arrived to find Sarah kneeling beside Nellie's motionless form, her hands stained with blood and her wedding ring clutched desperately in her fist. The scene spoke of violence and desperation in equal measure, and Morrison's cold smile suggested he saw opportunity in the chaos. Well, he said softly, his voice carrying a satisfaction that made Sarah's blood run cold. It seems our grieving mother has found her true nature at last. The other women in the kitchen had scattered like leaves before a storm, leaving Sarah alone with her unconscious victim, and a guard who clearly viewed the situation as beneficial to his own interest. Thomas continued to burn with fever in her arms, oblivious to the fact that his mother's desperate attempt to save him had only made their situation infinitely worse. Self-defense, Sarah whispered, though she knew the word.
Credo. No wait in a place where guilt was assumed and innocence was a luxury no one could afford. Morrison's laugh was soft and cruel. We'll see what the magistrate makes of that story, won't we? Attacking another prisoner, causing grievous harm. That's additional charges, Mrs. Whitmore. Additional time. As Nellie was carried away on a makeshift stretcher, blood still seeping from her head wound, Sarah realized she had traded her last hope of freedom for a wedding ring that might not even buy the medicine Thomas needed. The blood-stained handkerchief Morrison used to clean his hands would become evidence of her crime. Another link in the chain that bound her to this place of suffering. The first sign of unexpected kindness came wrapped in a bundle of clean straw that appeared outside Sarah's cell while she dozed fitfully against a stone wall. Thomas had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep, his fever still burning but his breathing slightly more regular than it had been hours earlier. Sarah woke to find the straw arranged carefully near her cell door, fresh and dry in a place where dampness ruled everything. She looked around the corridor suspiciously, expecting to find this was some cruel joke or trap set by the other inmates. But the corridor was empty except for the usual sounds of prison life, echoing from distant blocks. The straw was clean, cleaner than anything she had seen since arriving at Millbank. Someone had taken considerable effort to gather it, to keep it dry, and to place it where she would find it out, without drawing the attention of guards or other prisoners. Such an act required both resources and careful planning. She spread the straw carefully beneath Thomas, creating a barrier between his small body and the cold stone floor. For the first time in weeks he seemed to rest more comfortably, his fevered breathing easing slightly as warmth began to penetrate his chilled limbs. Old Mary Fitzgerald shuffled past on her way to the communal washing area, moving slowly but with the determined dignity that had sustained her through 7 decades of hardship. She paused near Sarah's cell, her weathered hands gripping the iron bars for support. "There's ways to help a fever," Mary said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Willow bark tea if you can find it. Cool cloths on the forehead. Keep him warm but not too warm." The advice was practical and welcome, but Sarah's heart sank as she realized how impossible it would be to obtain willow bark in prison. Mary seemed to read her thoughts and continued with gentle persistence. "Sometimes the guards throw out tea leaves from their own meal, not often. But sometimes, and there's plants that grow in the exercise yard if you know what to look for." Mary's knowledge came from raising 5 children of her own before poverty and desperation had driven her to steal medicine for a sick grandchild. Her wisdom was hard-earned through years of keeping children alive against impossible odds. "Why are you helping me?" Sarah asked, genuinely puzzled by this unexpected kindness. Mary's smile was sad but genuine. "Because because that little one deserves better than this place can give him. Because sometimes helping others is the only way to hold on to who we used to be." Throughout the day, Sarah began to notice other small kindnesses that might have been coincidence but felt deliberate. A guard left his water bucket unattended near her cell long enough for her to soak a rag and create the cool cloths Mary had suggested. Catherine Webb, despite her earlier rejection, left behind a piece of bread that was cleaner and less moldy than the usual prison fare. Even more surprising was the subtle shift in how some of the other women treated her. The news of her fight with Nellie had spread through the prison, with the speed that gossip always traveled in confined space. But instead of the condemnation Sarah had expected, she found herself receiving nods of quiet approval from women who understood that sometimes violence was the only language that desperation could speak. The change was most noticeable in how the more predatory inmates began to give her space. Word had spread that the quiet young mother was willing to fight when cornered, and in a place where weakness was currency, that reputation provided a form of protection she hadn't possessed before. In the evening, as shadows lengthened across the prison yard visible from her small window, Sarah found another unexpected gift. Tucked into the bundle of straw was a small piece of soap, clean and unused. Soap was a luxury in Millbank, carefully rationed and jealously guarded by those fortunate enough to possess it. She used it to clean Thomas gently, washing away the grime and sweat of his illness with a tenderness that felt like prayer. The simple act of caring for him properly, of being able to offer him cleanliness and comfort, restored something in her spirit that the prison had been slowly grinding away. As night fell and the prison settled into its restless approximation of quiet, Sarah found herself wondering about her mysterious benefactor. Someone was watching, someone who cared enough to risk their own safety to help a desperate mother and her dying child. The straw beneath Thomas rustled softly as he shifted in his sleep, and for the first time since arriving at Millbank, Sarah allowed herself to hope that perhaps they were not as alone as she had believed. The whispers began 3 days after Sarah's fight with Nellie Fair. They started as fragments of conversation overheard in the laundry room, pieces of information shared between women who had learned to communicate in ways that avoided the guards' attention. Prison walls might hold bodies, but they could never quite contain the flow of gossip and speculation that gave life to the desperate communities within. On the fourth day, Mary Fitzgerald approached Sarah during the brief exercise period allowed to the women prison. The old woman moved carefully, her arthritis making each step deliberate and painful, but her eyes held a clarity that spoke of important information to share. "You've been wondering about your guardian angel," Mary said quietly, settling beside Sarah on a wooden bench that overlooked the exercise yard. "The one leaving gifts outside your cell." Sarah nodded, her curiosity finally overcoming her caution. The kindnesses had continued. Clean rags that appeared when Thomas needed them, occasionally a piece of fruit that was fresher than anything served in the prison meals, once even a small vial of what might have been medicine. "His name is Marcus Kane," Mary continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Block C, cell 14. Been here 3 years now, and in all that time I've never seen him show interest in anyone else's troubles." The name meant nothing to Sarah, but she found herself studying the high walls that separated the women's section from the men's blocks. Block C was notorious, even among the women prisoners, the place where they kept the dangerous ones, the men too violent or unpredictable for the general population. "Why would someone like that help me?" Sarah asked, genuinely puzzled. "I've never even seen him." Mary's weathered features softened with something that might have been sympathy. "That's a story worth telling, child. Marcus Kane wasn't always a prisoner. Once upon a time he was Lieutenant Colonel Kane, a soldier with more medals than most men collect coins. The story that emerged was pieced together from years of prison gossip, fragments of truth, mixed with speculation and rumor. But the essential facts were clear enough to paint a picture of tragedy that rivaled Sarah's own. "Had a little girl, he did," Mary continued, her voice growing softer as she spoke of lost children. "Alice. Her name was, sweet little thing from what I heard. Lost his wife first. Consumption took her when the girl was barely 5. Kane tried to raise her alone, but there's men in this world who think a child without proper protection is fair game for their appetites." Sarah's blood chilled as she began to understand the direction of Mary's story. The thought of Thomas ever facing such dangers made her arms tighten protectively around him, even though he was safely in her cell. "3 men came for little Alice one night," Mary whispered, her words carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Gentlemen, they called them, men with money and position, who thought their status gave them the right to take whatever they wanted." The piece of charcoal that had appeared in Sarah's cell the previous day suddenly took on new meaning. She had used it to write a message of thanks on her cell wall, assuming her mysterious benefactor might see it during his own movements through the prison. Now she realized it represented something deeper, a means of communication between desperate people trying to maintain their humanity in an inhuman place. "Kane found them," Mary continued, her voice dropping even lower. "Found them with his daughter in the woods behind their cot. What he did to them, well, let's just say that men who prey on children learned that night what it means to face someone who truly understands violence." The image that formed in Sarah's mind was both terrible and oddly comforting. Someone had fought back against the kind of evil that destroyed innocence. Someone had chosen to stand between monsters and their victims, regardless of the cost. "The girl?" Sarah asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. "Damaged beyond fixing," Mary said sad. "The mind can only take so much before it breaks. She died in an asylum 6 months after Kane was imprisoned, wasted away like a flower cut from its roots." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the exercise yard as Sarah absorbed this information. Somewhere in Block C was a man who had lost everything, trying to protect his child, a man who now saw something in her situation that called to his own buried grief. "He sees his Alice when he looks at your Thomas," Mary concluded, "and maybe helping you is his way of saving the child he couldn't save before." The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface of prison life finally boiled over on a rain-soaked Thursday morning in April. Catherine Webb had been nursing her resentments since learning that Marcus Kane was behind the mysterious kindnesses shown to Sarah, and she had spent days gathering allies among the more bitter inmates, who saw any act of compassion as a threat to their own survival. Think you're special, do you? Catherine hissed as Sarah made her way to the laundry room. Thomas bundled against her chest in the clean rags that had appeared outside her cell. Got yourself a protector in Block C, making the rest of us look like fools. The confrontation drew the attention of other women, some curious, others eager for any break in the monotonous brutality of prison routine. Sarah tried to ignore Catherine's taunts, but the other woman was determined to force a reaction. My Bertie's been asking about you, Catherine continued, referring to her lover among the male prisoners, a violent man serving time for assault. Thinks maybe Marcus Kane needs to learn that some women aren't worth protecting. The threat was clear and Sarah felt her blood run cold. She had heard stories about Bertie Hayes, a man whose cruelty was legendary even in a place built on suffering. The thought of him targeting Marcus because of his kindness to her filled her with a guilt that was almost overwhelming. I never asked for his help, Sarah said quietly, trying to defuse the situation before it escalated further. But you took it, didn't you? Catherine shot back. Took it and never once thought about how it might affect the rest of us. You think the guards don't notice when one of us gets special treatment? You think there won't be consequences for all of us? Catherine's anger wasn't entirely unjustified. Sarah realized, in a place where any deviation from established patterns could result in punishment for entire groups, Marcus's kindness had indeed created ripples that affected others. The guards had noticed the improved conditions in Sarah's cell, and their increased scrutiny had made life harder for everyone in the women's block. The situation became dangerous when Catherine produced a makeshift weapon, a spoon handle that had been sharpened against stone until it resembled a crude knife. Prison regulations strictly forbade such weapons, but they were common enough among inmates who had learned that survival sometimes required violence. Maybe if something happened to you and that baby, Catherine said, her voice taking on a cold calculation that was more frightening than anger, Kane would learn to mind his own business. Other women began to back away, sensing that the confrontation was about to turn deadly. Even those who bore no particular fondness for Sarah recognized that Catherine had crossed a line that separated desperate survival from outright evil. Sarah found herself trapped against the laundry room wall, Thomas pressed protectively against her chest, while Catherine advanced with the weapon held low. The older woman's eyes held the flat, empty look of someone who had decided that another person's death was an acceptable price for her own comfort. Please, Sarah whispered, though she knew appeals to mercy would fall on deaf ears. He's just a baby. He never hurt anyone. Neither did I, until this place made me into what I am, Catherine replied. Now we all do what we have to do to survive. The attack came suddenly, Catherine lunging forward with the sharpened spoon aimed at Sarah's throat. But Sarah had learned something about fighting during her previous confrontation with Nellie, and desperation had taught her lessons that no amount of planning could replace. She twisted away from the weapon, while simultaneously lashing out with her elbow, catching Catherine in the ribs with enough force to knock the wind from her lungs. The older woman stumbled, and Sarah followed up by grabbing Catherine's wrist and slamming it against the stone wall until the makeshift weapon clattered to the floor. The fight ended as quickly as it had begun, with Catherine curled on the floor gasping for breath, while Sarah stood over her, Thomas still clutched protectively in her arms. The other women stared in stunned silence, surprised by the quiet young mother's capacity for violence, when truly threatened. "Stay away from my son," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying a hardness that hadn't been there before her imprisonment. "And stay away from me." The confrontation had changed something fundamental in the dynamic of the women's block. Sarah was no longer seen as just another desperate victim, but as someone willing and able to fight for what mattered to her. The first real conversation between Sarah and Marcus Kane began with a faded daguerreotype slipped through the iron bars of her cell window during the quiet hours after midnight. The image was worn at the edges from years of handling, but the faces it captured were still clear enough to tell a story of love and loss that needed no words. A young woman sat in a garden chair, her dress elegant but simple, her smile radiant with happiness. Beside her stood a man in military uniform, his bearing proud but gentle, one hand resting protectively on the woman's shoulder. Between them, perched on the woman's lap, was a little girl with dark curls and bright eyes that seemed to sparkle even in the static medium of early photography. Sarah studied the image by candlelight, seeing in those three faces the echo of her own lost dreams. This was Marcus Kane's family, she realized, the wife and daughter that Mary Fitzgerald had spoken of,
captured in a moment of perfect domestic joy that made their eventual tragedy all the more heartbreaking. The next morning brought an opportunity she hadn't expected. A new guard had been assigned to the women's block, a young man named Thomas Bennett, whose inexperience showed in his nervous movements and uncertain commands. Unlike the hardened veterans who usually patrolled the corridors, Bennett seemed genuinely troubled by the conditions he witnessed. During the brief exercise period, Bennett's unfamiliarity with prison routines created a gap in supervision that allowed Sarah to approach the high wall separating the women's yard from the men's exercise. She could hear voices from the other side, and carefully she called out in a voice barely above a whisper, "Marcus Kane." The response came after a long moment, deep and measured, with the careful diction of an educated man who had learned to choose his words precisely. "I am here, thank you," Sarah said simply, pressing her hand against the cold stone wall that separated them. "For everything, for the straw, the medicine, the kindness. I don't know why you've helped us, but Thomas is alive because of you." There was silence for so long that Sarah began to think he had moved away. Then his voice came again, softer than before, carrying years of pain in its careful modulation. "I had a daughter once, Alice. She would be about 8 years old now, if she had lived." The simple statement carried more weight than any elaborate explanation. Sarah found herself pressing closer to the wall, as if proximity could somehow bridge the gap between their separate prisons. "She was beautiful," Sarah said, thinking of the daguerreotype. "I can see the love in that photograph, the happiness." "Eleanor took that picture just 2 months before she died," Marcus replied. "We thought we had forever ahead of us. We thought love was enough to protect the people we cherished." Sarah understood the bitter lesson he had learned. Love alone wasn't enough when the world was determined to destroy everything good and innocent. But love was still worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible. "Thomas has been better since you started helping," she said. "The fever broke 3 days ago. He's still weak, but he's eating again. He's fighting." "Children are stronger than we give them credit for," Marcus observed. "They survive things that would break grown men. Alice fought longer than I thought possible, even after everything that happened to her." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Bennett's whistle, calling the women back inside, but Sarah remained by the wall for another precious moment. "Why do you help me?" she asked, the question that had been burning in her mind since learning his identity. "Because someone should," came the reply, echoing Mary Fitzgerald's earlier words. "Because in helping you and Thomas, I remember who I used to be before this place tried to make me into something else." That evening, Sarah found a small piece of paper tucked into the bundle of clean rags that had become her regular gift. Written in a careful hand were the words, "Your son has his father's eyes. Courage is inherited." The simple observation made her weep for the first time since arriving at Millbank, not from despair but from the unexpected comfort of being truly seen by someone who understood love. Marcus Kane might be separated from her by stone walls and iron bars, but his recognition of William's features in Thomas's face created a connection that transcended physical barriers. She spent that night writing her own message on a scrap of cloth, using the charcoal he had provided, telling him about William, about their brief happiness, about the dreams they had shared for their son's future. The stolen key appeared in Sarah's cell on a Tuesday morning, hidden beneath the usual bundle of clean straw that Marcus had been providing. It was small and tarnished, the kind used for storage rooms and lesser doors throughout the prison complex. Sarah stared at it for long minutes, understanding both the opportunity it represented and the terrible danger that came with possessing it. Catherine Webb had not forgotten her humiliation in the laundry room. If anything, defeat had sharpened her resentment into something more focused and dangerous. She had spent the weeks since their confrontation, building alliances among the more desperate inmates, women who saw Sarah's improving circumstances as a direct threat to their own survival. The key represented more than just access to forbidden areas of the prison. It was evidence of Marcus Kane's growing willingness to take serious risks for Sarah's benefit. Possession of stolen prison property would mean solitary confinement at best, additional years added to their sentences at worst. Yet here it was, passed to her through channels that required careful planning and considerable courage. The opportunity came during the midday meal, when Gord Thomas Bennett's continued inexperience created gaps in the usual supervision. Sarah slipped away from the dining hall, while the other women were distracted by an argument over food portions, making her way to the storage areas that lined the lower levels of the women's block. The key worked perfectly, opening a door that led to a series of rooms where prison supplies were kept. More importantly, it provided access to areas where conversations could be held without fear of immediate discovery. Sarah found herself in a narrow corridor that ran parallel to the main prison structure, close enough to the men's blocks that careful communication might be possible. "Marcus?" she called softly, pressing her ear against the stone wall that separated the building. His response came after several minutes, muffled but clear enough to understand. "Sarah, you found my gift. This is dangerous," she said, though she was grateful for the opportunity to speak more freely than their previous whispered exchanges had allowed. "If they catch us with this danger is relative in a place like this," Marcus replied. "I've been watching the guard rotations, studying the patterns. Young Bennett is more concerned with appearing competent than with actual security. The older guards trust him to handle routine supervision." Sarah marveled at the military precision that still governed Marcus's thinking, even after 3 years of imprisonment. He approached problems with the same systematic analysis that had once made him an effective officer, adapting those skills to the unique challenges of prison survival. "Catherine is planning something," Sarah warned. "She's been talking to the other women, building support for some kind of action against me. I think she means to use my connection to you as justification." "I know," Marcus said grimly. "Word travels between the blocks faster than the guards realize. Catherine's been in contact with Bertie Hayes and his associates. They see our friendship as a challenge to the established order." The established order was a delicate ecosystem of violence and intimidation that kept certain inmates in positions of relative power while others struggled at the bottom of the hierarchy. Sarah's protection by someone of Marcus's reputation threatened that balance, suggesting that alliances could form that bypassed the usual channels of prison politics. "Maybe we should stop," Sarah said reluctantly. "Maybe it's not worth the risk to others." "There are always risks," Marcus replied. "The question is whether we let fear dictate our choices, or whether we hold on to whatever humanity we can preserve." Through the walls, Sarah could hear the sound of his movement, the careful footsteps of someone accustomed to dangerous territory. She imagined him in his cell, perhaps holding his own memories of better times, fighting the same battle against despair that consumed her in the dark hours before dawn. "I've been thinking about Alice," Marcus said after a long pause, "about the person she might have become if she had lived. Strong like her mother, stubborn like her father. She would have loved Thomas, I think. She always wanted a little brother." The observation was both beautiful and heartbreaking, connecting their lost children across the boundaries of time and tragedy. Sarah found herself picturing Alice and Thomas playing together in some better world, free from the cruelty that had touched both their lives. "Tell me about her," Sarah said softly. "Tell me about the daughter you love." And in that narrow corridor, hidden from the eyes of guards and inmates alike, Marcus Kane began to share the stories that had sustained him through the
darkest period of his life. The braided hair bracelet took Sarah 3 evenings to complete, working by candlelight in her cell, while Thomas slept peacefully on his bed of clean straw. She had pulled the strands from her own hair, weaving them together with the careful attention to detail that her seamstress training had taught her. The finished piece was simple but elegant, a token of friendship that carried the weight of shared understanding. Marcus had been teaching her to read during their clandestine meetings in the storage corridor. He possessed a small prayer book that had somehow survived the confiscation of his personal belongings, its pages worn soft from years of handling. By the light of a smuggled candle, he guided her through the formation of letters and the construction of words, with the patient dedication of a born teacher. "Education is freedom," he told her during one of their sessions, his finger tracing the lines of text as Sarah struggled to make sense of the symbols on the page. "They can imprison our bodies, but knowledge belongs to us alone. Sarah had learned the basics of reading as a child, but poverty and circumstance had prevented her from developing those skills beyond the most elementary level. Under Marcus's tutelage, she began to discover a world of ideas and possibilities that had been closed to her throughout her adult life. The prayer book became their shared treasure, passed back and forth through hidden channels that Marcus had established with the help of sympathetic inmates. Sarah would practice her reading in the privacy of her cell, sounding out words slowly, while Thomas played with the simple toys that continued to appear among her mysterious gifts. Old Mary Fitzgerald's health had been declining steadily throughout the spring. The damp conditions and poor nutrition of prison life were particularly hard on someone of her advanced age, and Sarah could see the older woman growing frailer with each passing day. Mary spent more time resting in her cell, her movements becoming increasingly labored, as arthritis and general weakness took their toll. "She won't last much longer," Catherine Webb observed with the callous pragmatism that characterized her approach to everything in prison life. "Question is, who gets her possessions when she goes?" The comment revealed the harsh reality of prison existence, where death was so common that inmates had developed detailed protocols for redistributing the belongings of the deceased. Mary possessed little of material value, but in a place where any possession might mean the difference between survival and suffering, even the smallest items became precious. Sarah found herself spending more time with Mary during the exercise periods, listening to stories of the older woman's life, and trying to provide whatever comfort she could offer. Mary spoke of her children scattered across Ireland and England, most of whom had no idea where their mother had ended up. "I stole medicine for my grandson," Mary confided during one of their conversations. "Little Patrick, barely 3 years old, burning up with fever just like your Thomas was. The apothecary wanted more money than I'd seen in my whole life." The parallel to Sarah's own situation was unmistakable, another example of how desperation could drive good people to criminal acts. Mary had made the same choice Sarah might have made in similar circumstances, putting love for a child above respect for the law. "Did it help?" Sarah asked. "The medicine?" Mary's smile was both sad and proud. "He lived. Last I heard, Patrick was healthy and strong, growing up with his parents in County Cork. They never knew what I did to save him, and God willing they never will." The knowledge that her sacrifice had meaning gave Mary strength even as her body continued to fail. She faced her own mortality with the same quiet dignity that had carried her through 7 decades of hardship, finding peace in the knowledge that love had triumphed over law in at least one small corner of the world. Marcus noticed the change in Sarah's demeanor when she began wearing the braided hair bracelet during their reading sessions. The simple ornament represented something more than friendship between them. It was a declaration that they had chosen to care about each other, despite the institutional forces that sought to isolate and dehumanize them. "It's beautiful," he told her, his voice carrying genuine warmth. "Eleanor used to braid Alice's hair in patterns, just like that. She said it was a way of weaving love into something that would last." The comparison to his lost family was both honor and responsibility. Sarah understood that in accepting Marcus's protection and friendship, she had also accepted the weight of his grief and the trust of his damaged heart. Their relationship had evolved beyond the simple exchange of favors that had characterized its beginning. They had become allies in the truest sense, two people committed to preserving each other's humanity in a place designed to destroy it. The legal document arrived at Millbank Prison on a gray morning in early May, delivered by a clerk whose nervous demeanor suggested he rarely ventured into such forbidding territory. The official envelope bore the seal of Her Majesty's Court of Criminal Appeal, its red wax impression gleaming like a drop of blood against a cream-colored paper. Guard Captain Morrison received the document with his usual cold efficiency, but Sarah noticed something different in his expression as he read its contents. For the first time since she had known him, Morrison appeared genuinely surprised, perhaps even disturbed by what he was reading. The document remained in Morrison's possession for 2 days before Sarah learned its significance. The news came through Mary Fitzgerald, who, despite her failing health, maintained connections to the prison's informal information network that rivaled the official channels for speed and accuracy. "It's about your Marcus," Mary whispered during the evening meal, her voice barely audible above the clatter of tin plates and wooden spoons. "Seems there's been developments in his case." Official development. Sarah's heart began to race, though she couldn't tell whether the sensation came from hope or fear. In a place where news was rarely good, Any change in established patterns carried the potential for either salvation or further catastrophe. The full story emerged gradually over the following days, pieced together from fragments of information that filtered through the prison community with the persistence of water finding cracks in stone. Marcus Kane had not simply been a victim of circumstance, as Sarah had assumed. His case had been built on testimony that was now proving to be false. The three men Marcus had killed that night in Surrey had been protected by more than just their social position. They had been part of a network of wealthy individuals who preyed on vulnerable children, using their influence to escape consequences for their crimes. Marcus's violent intervention had threatened to expose their activities, making him a target for their collective resources. The witness who had testified against Marcus at trial, claiming to have seen him attack unprovoked gentlemen who were simply traveling through the area, had been paid handsomely for his perjured testimony. Now 3 years later, that same witness lay dying of consumption in a London hospital, and his conscience had finally overcome his greed. The deathbed confession detailed not only the false testimony, but also the broader conspiracy that had put Marcus in prison. Court officials had been bribed, evidence had been suppressed, and justice had been perverted to protect men whose crimes made Marcus's violent response seem not only justified but necessary. He was protecting his little girl, Mary continued, her voice carrying the weight of vindication long delayed. Everything he said at trial was true. Those men were monsters, and he did what any father would do when faced with such evil. The revelation recontextualized everything. Sarah thought she knew about Marcus's character and circumstances. He wasn't simply a man driven to violence by grief, as she had assumed. He was a father who had acted with perfect moral clarity in an impossible situation, only to be betrayed by a system that valued wealth and position above truth and justice. The implications of the discovery extended far beyond Marcus's personal vindication. If his case could be overturned, if powerful men could be exposed for their crimes, it suggested that even the seemingly absolute authority of the British legal system could be challenged by persistent truth. What happens now? Sarah asked, though she feared the answer might be nothing. Justice delayed was often justice denied, and 3 years in Millbank had already extracted a terrible price from Marcus's life. Mary's expression was cautious but hopeful. The court has ordered a review of his case. Could mean a new trial. Could mean the charges are dropped entirely. But these things take time, and powerful people don't like admitting they were wrong. That night, Sarah lay awake in her cell, holding Thomas close and thinking about the weight of injustice that Marcus had been carrying. She had seen him as her protector, but now she understood that he was as much a victim as she was, perhaps more so because his imprisonment had been the result of deliberate conspiracy rather than desperate circumstance. The corrupt official's seal that had authenticated the false testimony now seemed like a symbol of everything wrong with a system that claimed to dispense justice while actually serving the interests of wealth and power. Marcus had spent 3 years paying for the crime of defending his daughter against monsters who walked free because they could afford to purchase innocence. The corrupt official's seal found among the confiscated items in Warden Blackwood's private office told a story of institutional rot that extended far beyond Marcus Kane's wrongful conviction. The discovery came about through the investigation triggered by the dying witness's confession, when court officials began examining the evidence that had originally put Marcus in prison. The seal belonged to Magistrate Harold Pemberton, the same man who had presided over Marcus's trial with such apparent certainty about his guilt. Pemberton's personal effects, seized after his recent death from a heart attack, revealed a cache of documents that painted a picture of systematic corruption spanning decades. Sarah learned these details during her secret conversations with Marcus in the storage corridor, where his remarkable composure in the face of vindication surprised her almost as much as the injustice itself had. "I stopped expecting fairness from the world long ago," Marcus told her when she expressed outrage on his behalf. "The system that put me here was never designed to protect people like us. It exists to preserve the comfort of those with power and position." His acceptance wasn't resignation but rather the hard-earned wisdom of someone who had learned to distinguish between what could be changed and what must simply be endured. 3 years in Millbank had taught him that survival required focusing energy on achievable goals rather than abstract concepts of justice. "But this proves you were innocent," Sarah insisted.
This proves they lied about everything. It proves they were caught lying about everything, Marcus corrected gently. The truth was always there. What's changed is that someone finally decided it was safe to acknowledge it. The cynicism in his words reflected a deeper understanding of how power operated in their society. The same men who had protected Alice's attackers were now dead or discredited, making it politically convenient to admit that mistakes had been made. Marcus's vindication served the current establishment's interests by demonstrating their commitment to justice, even as it revealed the corruption of their predecessor. The investigation had uncovered evidence of Pemberton's involvement in protecting a network of wealthy predators who had used their social connections to escape consequences for their crimes. The magistrate had received substantial payments for ensuring that certain cases never reached trial or resulted in acquittals despite overwhelming evidence of guilt. Marcus's case had been different only in the violence of his response. Most parents of victimized children lacked both the skills and the determination to seek justice through force when the legal system failed them. Marcus's military training had made him uniquely capable of holding evil men accountable for their actions. The irony, Marcus observed with bitter humor, is that killing them was probably the most moral thing I've ever done. Yet here I sit in prison while they would have lived free if I had shown mercy. Sarah struggled to reconcile this revelation with her growing understanding of Marcus as a man of principle and honor. The violence she had heard whispered about in prison corridors now took on entirely different significance. He hadn't been a criminal at all, but rather an agent of justice in a world where justice was rarely available through legitimate channels. What happens now? She asked, echoing her earlier question to Mary but hoping for a more definitive answer from Marcus himself. Now we wait, Marcus replied with the patience of someone accustomed to institutional delays. The wheels of justice turn slowly, especially when they're admitting to previous failures. There will be reviews, hearings, committees formed to study the implications. Meanwhile, I remain here. The possibility of freedom seemed almost abstract to Marcus after 3 years of imprisonment. He had built a life within Millbank's walls, established routines and relationships that had become his reality. The prospect of returning to a world that had already taken everything he valued carried its own form of uncertainty. I think about Alice's grave sometimes, he admitted quietly. I was never able to visit it, never able to say goodbye properly. If I'm released, that will be the first place I go. Sarah heard in his voice the weight of a father's grief that prison had suspended but not resolved. Freedom would mean confronting losses that had been frozen in time by the artificial environment of incarceration. Marcus would have to learn how to live with his memories in a world that had moved on without him. The corrupt seal that had authenticated so many false documents now served as evidence of a broader pattern of institutional failure. But for Marcus, vindication couldn't restore what had been lost. It could only acknowledge that the taking had been wrong. Thomas's fever returned with a vengeance on the second Tuesday of May, arriving like an unwelcome ghost that had been lurking in the shadows waiting for the perfect moment to strike. This time, however, Sarah was not the desperate, helpless woman who had pleaded uselessly in the corridors months earlier. She had allies now, resources, and most importantly, she had learned to fight. The smuggled medicine bottle that appeared outside her cell that morning was unlike anything she had seen before. The glass was clean, the cork was fresh, and the liquid inside had the clarity and smell of something that had come from an actual apothecary, rather than the prison's makeshift remedies. Where did this come from? Sarah asked Marcus during their evening conversation in the storage corridor, holding the bottle up to catch what little light filtered through the narrow window. I still have friends in the world outside these walls, Marcus replied carefully. Men who served under my command, people who believe in paying their debts. Young Bennett has a sick mother in Whitechapel, and he's discovered that his meager guard's salary doesn't stretch to cover proper medical care. Sarah understood immediately. Marcus had orchestrated a trade, medicine for his former guard's mother in exchange for medicine for Thomas. It was the kind of complex negotiation that required both careful planning and significant resources, demonstrating just how far Marcus was willing to extend himself for their welfare. This could mean solitary confinement for all of us, if we're caught, Sarah observed, though she was already calculating the proper dosage for Thomas, based on his weight and the severity of his symptoms. Everything we do here carries risk, Marcus replied. The question is whether we let fear paralyze us, or whether we act on what we know to be right. The medicine proved effective within hours. Thomas's fever broke during the night, and by morning his color had returned to something approaching normal. Sarah found herself weeping with relief as she held his small body against her chest, feeling the regular rhythm of healthy breathing that had been absent for terrifying days. But their success came at a cost that became apparent during the morning inspection. Guard Captain Morrison arrived at Sarah's cell with an expression that suggested he knew exactly what had transpired, though he lacked sufficient evidence to take immediate action. "Remarkable recovery," Morrison observed, his voice carrying the cold calculation that Sarah had learned to fear. "One might almost think the child had received proper medical attention." Sarah met his gaze steadily, drawing on reserves of strength she had discovered during her months of imprisonment. "Children are resilient, Captain. Sometimes they recover on their own when given proper care and attention." Morrison's smile was predatory. "Indeed, and sometimes they receive assistance from unexpected sources. One wonders what favors might have been exchanged to secure such assistance." The threat was clear but unspecific, the kind of institutional intimidation that relied on fear and uncertainty rather than concrete accusation. Morrison couldn't prove anything, but he wanted Sarah to know that he was watching, waiting for any excuse to bring the full weight of prison authority down on her and anyone who had helped her. "I've been wondering about your relationship with certain inmates in other blocks," Morrison continued, his tone conversational but menacing. "Prison walls are supposed to prevent such relationships from developing. When they fail to do so, additional measures sometimes become necessary." Sarah understood that he was threatening to separate her from Marcus, possibly by transferring one of them to another facility entirely. The thought of losing her protector and friend filled her with dread, but she forced herself to remain calm and composed. "I follow all prison regulations, Captain," she said quietly. "I keep to my assigned areas and speak only to approved personnel." Morrison's laugh was soft and cruel. "Of course you do. Just as I'm sure you've never possessed any contraband items, never participated in unauthorized communications, never violated any of the countless rules that govern life in this institution." He left without taking any immediate action, but his message was unmistakable. Sarah's small victories had drawn unwanted attention from authorities, who saw any deviation from absolute control as a threat to their power. The medicine that had saved Thomas might ultimately cost them everything they had built together. That evening Sarah held her son close and tried to calculate how much time they might have before Morrison found an excuse to act on his threats. Freedom seemed impossibly distant, but survival had become a day-to-day proposition that required constant vigilance and careful planning. The guard's uniform button found its way to Sarah through a chain of carefully planned exchanges that revealed the depth of the network Marcus had assembled during his years at Millbank. The brass button torn from Guard Bennett's coat during what appeared to be a routine scuffle with an inmate was actually a signal that the final phase of their desperate plan was about to begin. Sarah examined the button in the dim light of her cell, understanding its significance without needing explanation. Marcus had spent weeks studying the prison's routines, identifying weaknesses in security, and building alliances with inmates and guards who might be willing to help when the moment came. The button represented the culmination of that careful preparation. The plan itself was audacious in its simplicity. During the next morning's exercise period, when Guard Bennett would be supervising the women's yard while the more experienced guards were occupied elsewhere, a carefully orchestrated distraction would create an opportunity for Sarah and Thomas to reach the medical facility in the prison's administrative building. "The prison doctor keeps proper medicines in his office," Marcus had explained during their last conversation in the storage corridor. "Real treatments, not the watered-down remedies they usually provide for inmates. If Thomas is to have any chance of surviving another illness, he needs access to those supplies." The medical facility was located in a section of the prison that was strictly off-limits to inmates under normal circumstances. Reaching it would require crossing through multiple checkpoints and past several guard stations, a journey that would be impossible without inside assistance and careful timing. Guard Bennett's cooperation had been secured through a combination of mutual benefit and moral persuasion. His mother's ongoing illness had made him desperate for additional resources, and Marcus's connections to former military colleagues had provided medicine that no guard's salary could afford. More importantly, Bennett had witnessed the daily cruelty of prison life and had begun to question whether his duty lay with institutional regulations or basic human decency. Tomorrow morning, Sarah whispered to Thomas as she prepared him for sleep, wrapping him carefully in the clean rags that had become their most precious possessions. Tomorrow we take a chance that could change everything. The other women in the block had noticed the subtle changes in atmosphere that preceded significant events. Catherine Webb watched Sarah with suspicious eyes, sensing that something was about to happen, but unable to identify the specific threat. Old Mary Fitzgerald offered what encouragement she could, her failing health making her more concerned with spiritual preparation than practical assistance. God watches over desperate mothers, Mary told Sarah during their final conversation before the attempt. He knows the lengths we'll go to protect our children, and he judges us by our love rather than our methods. Sarah spent the night in prayer and preparation, alternating between fierce determination and paralyzing fear. The plan offered Thomas's best chance for survival, but failure would mean separation, additional charges, and possibly the loss of everything they had built together during their months of imprisonment. Marcus would be taking the greatest risk of all. His part in the plan required him to create a distraction in the men's yard that would draw attention away from the women's section during the critical moments of Sarah's movement through the prison. The distraction would necessarily involve violence, and violence from someone of Marcus's reputation would bring swift and severe retaliation. I've lived with the consequences of my choices for 3 years, Marcus had told her when she expressed concern for his safety. Whatever happens tomorrow, I'll face it knowing I chose to protect something worth protecting. The guard's uniform button represented more than just a signal. It was a symbol of how far ordinary people could be pushed before they chose conscience over compliance. Bennett's willingness to risk his position, and possibly his freedom, demonstrated that even within institutional structures designed to crush compassion, individual humanity could still assert itself. As dawn approached, Sarah found herself thinking about William and the promises she had made at his graveside. She had sworn to keep their son safe, to give him opportunities for a better life than either of them had known. Tomorrow's attempt would determine whether those promises could be kept or whether they would remain forever unfulfilled dreams in a world that seemed designed to destroy hope. The brass button caught
First light of morning through her cell window, its polished surface reflecting possibilities that ranged from salvation to catastrophe. In a few hours, Sarah would learn which of those possibilities would define the rest of their lives. The broken chain that had once secured the door to the prison's medical facility lay twisted on the stone floor like a metal snake, its iron links separated by the kind of precise force that spoke of military training and desperate determination. Sarah clutched Thomas against her chest as she stepped over the remnants of what had been considered impenetrable security, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. The morning had begun exactly as Marcus had planned. During the exercise period, a carefully orchestrated fight in the men's yard had drawn most of the guards' attention, leaving guard Bennett as the sole supervisor for the women's section. Bennett's nervous energy had been palpable as he unlocked doors that should have remained sealed, his hands shaking as he led Sarah through corridors she had never seen before. But the plan had gone catastrophically wrong when Catherine Webb and her allies realized what was happening. Catherine's shouts of alarm had brought additional guards running, and what should have been a quiet movement through empty hallways had become a desperate flight through a prison suddenly alive with pursuit. "This way," Bennett urged, his young face pale with fear as the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the administrative building. "The medical office is just ahead." Behind them, Sarah could hear the chaos spreading through the prison as word of the escape attempt reached guard Captain Morrison. His voice cut through the confusion like a blade, issuing orders with the efficiency of someone who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity to assert absolute control. The medical office, when they finally reached it, was a revelation that made Sarah understand why such desperate measures had been necessary. Shelves lined with proper medicines, surgical instruments that gleamed with cleanliness, beds with actual mattresses and clean linens. It was everything the prison's general population was denied in the name of institutional economy. "Take what you need," Bennett said urgently, standing guard at the door while Sarah searched frantically through bottles and vials for medicines that might help Thomas. "We have minutes at most before they find us." But even as Sarah gathered supplies with shaking hands, she could hear the sound of violence from the men's yard growing more intense. Marcus's distraction had escalated beyond anything they had anticipated, and the price he was paying for their opportunity was becoming terrifyingly clear. The confrontation with Catherine's faction had been inevitable from the moment Sarah accepted Marcus's protection. Catherine had gathered every bitter, desperate woman in the prison who saw Sarah's improving circumstances as a direct threat to their own survival. They had been waiting for an opportunity to strike back, and Sarah's escape attempt had provided the perfect justification. "He's bleeding badly," came a shout from the yard below, and Sarah's blood turned to ice as she realized they were talking about Mark. The distraction he had created to protect her escape had become a battle for his life, and she was the cause of whatever was happening to him. The sound of splintering wood announced that their pursuers had reached the medical building. Morrison's voice was closer now, issuing commands with the cold precision that had made him feared throughout Millbank. Bennett pressed a package of medicines into Sarah's hands with desperate urgency. "There's a door at the back," he whispered, his voice breaking with fear and determination. "It leads to the outer courtyard. From there you might be able to reach the main gate." Sarah understood that Bennett was offering her something beyond medicine for Thomas. He was offering her freedom itself. The outer courtyard connected to areas of the prison where deliveries were made, where the boundary between incarceration and the outside world was thinnest. But freedom would mean abandoning Marcus to face the consequences of their actions alone. The violence in the men's yard had escalated precisely because he had chosen to protect her, and leaving him to suffer for that choice felt like a betrayal of everything their friendship had meant. "Go," Bennett urged, hearing the footsteps growing closer. "This was always about saving your son. Don't let Marcus's sacrifice be meaningless." Sarah looked down at Thomas, healthy and alert in her arms, thanks to the medicine Marcus had provided, then at the package of supplies that could keep him that way for months to come. The choice between gratitude and survival had never been more clear or more impossible to make. The broken chain on the floor caught the light from the window. Its separated links, telling the story of barriers overcome through determination and sacrifice. 5 years later, in a small cottage in the countryside outside London, Sarah Whitmore Kane sat by a window watching her son play in the garden with a simple wooden rattle that had been carved by loving hands in the darkness of a prison cell. Thomas, now 6 years old and healthy beyond anything she had dared hope during those terrible months at Millbank, chatted happily to himself as he built elaborate fortresses from fallen leaves and broken twigs. The cottage was modest but warm, surrounded by gardens that Sarah tended with the same careful attention she had once devoted to her son's survival. The vegetables grew strong in the rich soil, and flowers bloomed in carefully planned succession throughout the seasons, creating beauty that seemed impossible after the gray despair of prison walls. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace sat a small daguerreotype in a simple wooden frame, the same photograph that Marcus had once treasured in his cell, showing his wife Eleanor and daughter Alice in a moment of perfect happiness. Beside it stood a newer photograph, taken just months earlier, showing Sarah and Thomas on the cottage's front step, their faces bright with the kind of contentment that comes after surviving the unthinkable. Marcus Kane's name had been officially cleared 6 months after their escape from Millbank Prison. The investigation triggered by the dying witness's confession had ultimately exposed a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of British society. Magistrates had been stripped of their positions, court officials had faced criminal charges, and the legal system had undergone reforms that made such systematic injustice more difficult to perpetrate. But vindication had come too late for Marcus himself. The injuries he sustained during the violent confrontation that enabled Sarah and Thomas's escape had proved fatal despite the medical attention he finally received. He had lived long enough to learn that his name would be cleared, long enough to ensure that Sarah and Thomas had reached safety, but not long enough to experience the freedom he had sacrificed everything to secure. Guard Thomas Bennett had faced court-martial for his role in their escape, but the same investigation that cleared Marcus had revealed the broader pattern of institutional cruelty that had driven Bennett to act. His sentence was reduced to dismissal from service, and he had since found work as a clerk in a law office that specialized in prison reform. Sarah visited Marcus's grave every month, bringing fresh flowers and news of Thomas's progress to the simple headstone that bore his name and dates alongside the inscription, "Father, Protector, Man of Honor." The cemetery was peaceful, shaded by old oak trees that rustled softly in whatever breeze carried across the hillside. Thomas had no memory of his time in prison, for which Sarah was grateful beyond measure. To him, the cottage had always been home, and the stories Sarah told him about his early years focused on love and protection rather than desperation and fear. She would tell him about Marcus when he was older, when he could understand the magnitude of the sacrifice that had secured his freedom. The wooden rattle that Marcus had carved during the final weeks of his life had become Thomas's most treasured possession, though he didn't yet understand its significance. Sarah had found it among Marcus's few belongings when Bennett brought word of his death, along with a letter written in Marcus's careful hand. "Teach him to be brave," the letter had said. "Teach him to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Teach him that love is the only thing that truly matters in this world, and that sometimes love requires us to sacrifice everything for the people we cherish." Sarah had followed those instructions to the letter, raising Thomas with the values that Marcus had embodied, even in the darkest circumstances. The boy was growing into someone who possessed his father William's gentleness and Marcus's quiet strength, a combination that filled Sarah with hope for the future he would build. The afternoon sun streamed through the cottage windows as Sarah prepared tea and watched her son play in the garden that had become their sanctuary. Thomas looked up and waved at her through the glass, his smile bright with the uncomplicated joy that childhood should contain, and Sarah waved back with a heart full of gratitude for the man who had made such moments possible. In her hands she held the wooden rattle that connected past to present, carved by someone who had understood that love transcends death, and that the greatest victories are often won by those who never lived to see them celebrate.